Chris, I have this privilege of asking you a few initial questions about your book, and then we will open it up for the audience to also have a discussion. I love the title, first of all, Mao and Markets. It just conveys the kind of contradictions in the Chinese system so well. China has markets, right? China has private businesses. They operate to try to make profits, make money. But China is not a capitalist country. China is controlled just by one party and increasingly by one person. So, Chris, tell us, what motivated you to write this book now, and why is it an important topic?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the question. Thank you for having me, Rory. Really appreciate it. I think I between 2010 and 2020 spent about 3.5 years in China, and I was a business school researcher, so doing a lot of interacting with business leaders, collecting data, and so many of those experiences really struck me. Coming from the West. Like one example is in maybe 2011 or 12, sort of when I first started going to China a lot, I had the opportunity to interview Captain Wei Jiafu, who is or was the CEO of Costco, which is one of the largest shipping companies in the world. He, was the head of a shipping company, so he liked to be called captain, which is sort of another sort of interesting aspect. But I walked into his office, and he had a life-size statue of Mao with the two flags, CCP flag and the flag of China. And I thought, this is really strange. I mean, that some leading CEO, and not just a CEO, he was an state-owned enterprise, obviously, but they, I think, owned a large part of the Boston port, the LA port, very international company, but really very much signaling his interest in sort of the CCP and ideology. And there's a lot of other experiences I've had similarly where sort of my U.S. frame of reference was shocked at many times about how deep the ideology was among the leaders. But then conversely, the markets are amazing. And so I, for a long time, was taking students from both Harvard and Cornell to China for 2 weeks. And almost invariably, one would pull me aside and say something like, China is not really a communist country, because of how giant buildings and amazing infrastructure. So, I mean, really these two sides of things is what I've been working on over the past 10 years in my research.
Amazing. I love the story with Captain Wei Jiafu.
Yeah.
But are you sure that Mao's statue is not just a decoration? Do you really think he still believes in Maoist or communism ideology? Yeah,
good. Certainly that's a good, very good point. And I think that, this was actually one of the reasons why we, me and a number of various students, one of which Kunyan is a co-author and it contributed tremendously to the book. That is frequently, if you read economics papers, the rationale. It's all about sort of an instrumental, we really don't believe this, but actually we're just going to have a Mao statue or, say something in a speech. But there's actually, ways that we can sort of see how the discourse and behaviors of companies that actually have, whether it's a CCP member that joined the CCP before Mao, or before Mao passed away or after, or other sort of indicators that they truly are actually acting in a way that reflects their ideology. And I would also say that even if people say, well, we don't actually believe this, going through an education, an education system that actually has a lot of ideological emphasis, joining the CCP, which is a process of, sort of learning, being indoctrinated, writing reports, working with mentors. I think these aspects have very, very deep effects on people, and there's a lot of social science research that suggests that, those through education and socialization, even if you think you may not believe in it, actually is a deep cognitive effect.
Give us some examples about the actual impacts on people, on businesses, how the ideology really affects them.
Sure. So I don't want to get, sort of bore people with a bunch of methods talk, but so the first study that I did in this that tried to really understand whether business executives would actually act in their ideological interest versus their self-interest was a study of internationalization of Chinese companies. And so have a database of tens of thousands of companies, and actually the businesses that actually refused to go international, this is despite actually during this time period the Chinese Communist Party is telling companies, go global. The ones that we'd sort of try to find ways to indicate whether they have a deeper connection to Maoism. So this would be, joining the CCP before Mao passes away. Actually, the socialization process after that changed quite a bit. Growing up in regions where there's stronger sort of Maoist sort of imprint, whether they were liberated earlier, whether they experienced the Cultural Revolution. So all of these sort of indicators in the data predict very strongly whether that these companies will not internationalize. So this is one sort of, I guess, methodological way to untie that. It's not as sort of evocative as these stories, but it is a way to research it.
Right. So you mentioned that it took you 10 years to research on the book. That's basically the first 10 years of Xi Jinping's rule of China. Do you feel like during the course of research, by talking to the entrepreneurs in China, the Chinese leaders, Chinese officials, do you feel like this emphasis on ideology has really grown over time, and that has, what kind of impact, if so, what kind of impact that has had on businesses on the ground?
Yeah, I think without a doubt that there's definitely becoming and we sort of read this in the papers in the Wall Street Journal and your articles, actually. And it's not as business oriented, but from my personal experience as a professor. So I started going to China a little before Xi took office in 2010. And back then when I was teaching, things were very, very open. One of the areas that I teach in is actually in social movements and civil society. And I taught a class at Peking University. And no one cared that I was teaching, and we were talking about the Arab Spring, and we were talking about, taxi drivers in Chongqing organizing via cell phone. This was totally fine. Then sort of very slowly over time, there was a lot more scrutiny on me and people saying, well, you have to be careful what you talk about, people checking my syllabus, at one point saying, explicitly do not talk about anything that's sensitive or political. And so I think that over this time period, as we all know, there's been a really very much a constraint of ideology, and I've experienced that as a faculty member. And many of the people that most of the people I interviewed are actually since 2017 or so, and they're very really talk very positively about Mao and how they quote him extensively in their sort of business strategies and progress.
Fascinating. I have seen quite a few people in the audience are from China. My personal experiences. I grew up in the Deng Xiaoping era, right? Reform and opening. That's an era of China really embracing market principles and the Western world. People admire Mao mostly as the founding father of the PRC, but I just friends I know, family members, we never really believed in the ideology. So, but you're now saying that aside from the government's effort to inject greater ideological purity into the system, people actually are believing it.
So my guess is that it's probably deeper than what people would necessarily say. And I think, another sort of anecdote that really struck me in how deep, in some ways, education and socialization process is I was, one year when I was at Cornell, I was on an admissions panel, and there was a Chinese applicant, and I was sort of scanning. It was online, his file, very quickly, and I saw, just sort of jumped off the page at me, was Mao Zedong. I could see there was a transcript that had, so a bunch of words. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I looked, and it was like Mao Zedong Sishang. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. He's taking a Maoism class. It turns out this student had taken 2, both required. I then looked at all the other Chinese students also were taking Mao classes up through college, and so people say to me when I actually teach on this in Chinese, people say, well, I really didn't believe that. I said, well, did you take classes through college? And they said yes, and maybe it's not that seen as important. Clearly, I don't think they were teaching that in the college entrance exam. But going through this media, movies, I do think that there is a cultural resonance, which is why when, even though there was this long period of reform and opening, when Xi Jinping really becomes much more hardline, I think it resonates in a way that it would not were there this historical continuity. And I think that, he himself, quotes Mao and actually follows a number of Mao's strategies. So I think, I think that this is one of the reasons why we wrote the book, is because we do think that there is this sort of early experience that then creates a through line that helps understand why Xi has done what he's done, or sort of, how he resonates.
Yeah, I'd love to ask you about the parallels between Mao Zedong 思想, Mao Zedong thought, and Xi Jinping thought, and the parallels between Mao Zedong and Xi Jinping.
Sure. So I must admit I'm not as familiar with Xi Jinping thought as my study of. He's written, I think, 160 some books, and
学习强国, right? You should use that app.
The app, where I know the app, the 学习强国, that's a good idea. That might be my next study. But
you can earn points, right? For
exactly.
For for shopping and stuff.
Yeah. I actually did think about downloading it, but then someone told me that there may be some way to monitor you through it, so I didn't download it.
And then also it's useless in New York. You can't go to Bergdorf and use that.
I was just interested in seeing what it was. I would not necessarily the points. I'm sure I would have done very poorly on it, actually. But the interesting thing. I mean, so some of the things that we pick up in some of our subsequent writing is. A number like the importance of nationalism is a big issue. Controlling history and historical nihilism as a concept is very important, and not actually sort of in some ways negating Mao, like like happened in the Soviet Union, which is seen as a big reason why the Soviet Union fell. I think also the idea of sort of governance by campaigns is very important, and so. You have obviously these famous Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, but many other sort of campaigns, anti-rightist campaign, the Yan'an rectification. And I think this idea of actually governing by campaigns is something that we see as well. Even, obviously the People's War against COVID. I think even things like the semiconductor focus it's like a campaign around actually succeeding in an industrial era, anti-corruption campaign. I mean, so I think that's another sort of area where there's some important resonance.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think one Maoist tactic Xi Jinping definitely has adopted is, mass mobilization, right? But he made it more high-tech, using digital apps, right, to control the society. So in your book, there's this one term that really struck me. It's called communist entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Explain what that means.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, it is sort of a little bit as you would think. I mean, these are people that are running businesses, being entrepreneurial, but they're members of the CCP. And this is, during our time period of study, there's anywhere, depending on from 25% to around, 40%. And obviously, there was a famous in early 2000s, Jiang Zemin has the 3 represents, which was about bringing productive forces like entrepreneurs into the party. And we do see a jump then. But that, I think, we sort of analyze a bit the difference between those entrepreneurs, which actually were invited to join because of their success as entrepreneurs. And if you think about it, it's a really, even though I think the name is very bad, 3 represents, it's a really smart strategy to co-opt the productive forces in the economy and bring those into the party. Those are actually, though, as we try to analyze in the book, different from entrepreneurs that actually they sort of grew up, they joined the CCP, maybe they went to work in some state-owned quasi-state-owned enterprise or part of the government, and then they had the opportunity to something was being spun off, or for a variety of ways they had these township and village enterprises that earlier than a lot of the large state-owned enterprises actually were run by entrepreneurs. And so these communist entrepreneurs are a little bit different because they actually went through the socialization process and then founded a company as opposed to actually joining the company later on. And I think these entrepreneurs, both types, will be increasingly important, I think, as China continues its economy, because they both provide productivity and economic growth, but are in many ways co-opted by the CCP. So I think they provide a real sort of role of like a fulcrum, or a important lever to continue. Hopefully for China, or hopefully China wants to grow its economy, but a lot of the policies of the past number of years, not just COVID, but the crackdowns on a variety of industries have raised a lot of questions about actually how much growth there will be in the coming years.
Exactly. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because that really brings us back to what's going on right now. I mean, I wonder if we talk to really different people here, because all the entrepreneurs we've been talking to in the past year or so, they are so disappointed. They felt like really let down by the party, by the leadership. And I don't feel like any strong belief among them in the system. And a lot of them, as you know, have left China.
Right.
And just recently I was talking to someone in Zhejiang province, the province that's known for entrepreneurship.
Right.
And he was telling me, he said, Lingling, I don't know. I'm wondering out loud if the best days are behind us. So this feeling is something I never heard or experienced even just last year. So I'm just wondering, when you talk to them, most recently, have you noticed any change in their sentiment, in their feelings, in their beliefs?
So so most of this was done up until 2020, when I was able to be in China.
Right.
I had a research center in Chengdu help with a lot of the interviews, sort of in probably 2021 or some. So I think that the sort of COVID lockdowns over the past 3 years might have broken even the staunchest Maoist, possibly. I don't know. I'm sort of joking in some ways, but also there's tremendous diversity in entrepreneurs in China. I mean, there's like 25 million entrepreneurs, and like smaller firms actually make up, I think, about 60% of China's GDP. I mean, we see these large, well-known Huawei or Tencent, and obviously the state-owned firms, but actually smaller entrepreneurs, throughout cities throughout China actually are these tremendously productive forces. And these are the folks that we mostly sourced for our interview. So it wasn't, even though I've interviewed Jack Ma, it wasn't his perspective necessarily that we were taking. It was more sort of on the ground in like Chengdu, Changsha, and other, less first and second tier.
I see.
Or I guess those are first, second tier cities. But so
the mom and pop businesses.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there were some, larger chains as well, but it was not the businesses that you would necessarily hear of in the U.S.
Right. I can't help but wonder, given the findings from your book, the ideological component of Chinese system just getting stronger and stronger, what that means to the relationship between the U.S. and China, the most consequential relationship in the whole world. It's sort of like has gone from deep engagement, increased competition, to today that we're talking about the need for guardrails so that the two superpowers don't go into war. So if you were advising President Biden on China policy, on the economic policy, based on what you know and what you have found about China's economic system, what kind of advice would you give to Biden? Continuing engagement, or just really be hard on China, try to decouple, or what kind of advice would you give him?
So I would give sort of two things. That's a very good question. So first of all, I want to say in general, I think that at some level engagement is absolutely essential because these are the two largest economies. They're the two, in some ways, world superpowers. If there's not some engagement, things can actually spiral out of control in a very negative way. And so I do think we need to keep talking, working with each other. I also think for our own interests, there's all kinds of discussion on social media I've seen about how, U.S. expertise on China is really declining. And so for that reason also, I think that, engagement is really important. I think there's some folks from the Shortman Scholars here tonight. I think like that type of program is hugely important around, continuing ties between the U.S. and China. So I think that have to find some way around being able to engage. That said, I do think that hardline isn't I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but I do think I would take many things that the Chinese government or the CCP says they're going to do with a big grain of salt. Mm-hmm. I would very much follow I wasn't a huge fan of Ronald Reagan, but sort of the trust but verify type of thing. I would, so I would really not be trustful of the CCP. I would think that in areas of national security, I think we need to be very strong in protecting ourselves. Right. And I think that the U.S. context is a bigger challenge because you have business interests that actually wanting to gain access to that market, and so they are lobbying the government in some ways against the what are essentially, in my opinion, national security. So I do think, finding some way to engage is essentially important, is really, really important, but also just we have to be very, very clear in protecting national security and making hard decisions that may actually have some negative economic consequences on some important U.S. industries and actors.
Sure. I just find China very difficult to deal with. Right? Yeah. It's a huge market. Everybody wants access to a market. Right. But at the same time, it's just so becoming so much more repressive. And, just a few weeks ago, I had a conversation with economist / consultant, and he made some really fascinating comments about foreign businesses in China. Just as recently as last year, if you were to ask Apple or someone else about, what is your plan B for China, they would respond, our plan B for China is China, right?
Right.
So there, no one really was in a serious way thinking about leaving China. But these days, a lot of them are making contingent plans. I was just talking to a tech investor today, and he was telling me, because of geopolitical risks, and some companies are trying to become asset light in China, right? They convert hard assets into some sort of licensing agreements. So in time of a crisis, they don't lose the hard assets, right? So it's just fascinating to me that how people's attitudes toward China has changed just in a short period of time. In your research, during your research on the book, have you talked to any foreign businesses in China, and what did they tell you?
Yeah, and I've talked to a number of them much more recently, including some folks at Apple. And I think this is a huge challenge, and I think that many times people think of China as a consumer market, but actually the supply chain that China has, I think, is even a more powerful piece of leverage than actually the market to sell goods. I mean, Apple is a good example. I mean, they sell, a lot of iPhones in China, I'm sure, but the infrastructure to actually produce iPhones, and I know that I've been reading that they're going to move to Vietnam or India or wherever in some, but from what I understand, it's the depth of the relationship with the producers there. China has the sort of internal migrant population of 200 or 300 million people that can actually be mobilized to work in the factories if there's production spikes or whatever. Whereas Vietnam, even as a country, has 95 million people. So, I think that the human capital around manufacturing, the expertise in facilities that China has developed over the past, 20, 30 years, I think make it really, really hard for U.S. companies to pull out. And I think that supply chain leverage is much stronger even than the consumer market potential.
Yeah, U.S. companies like GM and other, big Intel.
Right.
And those companies spend hundreds of billions of dollars in China over decades. So it's hard to really just forget about all that and leave, right? Yeah. So I have one more question to ask you, and then we will get the audience to ask some questions. So you told me you have a family, and they live in Pittsburgh. And you have a life here in New York, and you also go to London to teach. And you also have some teaching gigs in China. So how did you find time to write this book?
Good question. I think one answer I'll give, a quick one, is actually the COVID situation was somewhat beneficial to me. I mean, it was actually, a horrible thing for many, many people, but I, not having to travel, actually having all my classes online, not commuting to Ithaca for some of them. So actually being able to, it was almost, and I'd done the research for about 10 years. And so it actually, the, few years of COVID provided a really, that was part of the reason why, even though it looks like I should not have any time, there was actually some time to work on it.
I see. Well, I hope you write another book. After I wrote my book, I felt like I finally came out of my prison sentence. Anyway, let's get some questions. If you have questions, please line up, right? We should line up. Oh. Yeah, we have mic here. Please, yes, use the mic. Thank you.
So, in late 70s, that's a question for a professor. In late 70s, when Deng Xiaoping decided to open the economy, and we were the first generation to benefit from that. I was able to actually go to Fudan University and came to America 40 years ago, and we really benefited because he sent his deputy, Gu Mu, who was a vice premier, to tour Europe and came back with a 25,000 word report telling Deng Xiaoping that we're 20 years behind the West. We have to do something. That gave Deng Xiaoping the power to really convince everybody else, let's open up. Now, back then, there was really not that much advantage being a CCP member or not for the young people, because I would never qualify, because came from the old money banking, we were the persecuted ones. So, but anyway, fast forward to today. There are 100 million CCP members in China, 1 for every 3 Americans. When you look at the numbers, that's how big it is. Is there an advantage in today's young people in China? I know that's the fastest growing segment in the new CCP members are the ones under 30 years old. Is there still an advantage for them to be a CCP in order to promote their business, or not anymore because the government now has cracked down on so many things and made it difficult for a CCP member even to become a successful entrepreneur? So has things changed since?
My sense, it would still definitely be a benefit. I mean, I think as the government continues, or the CCP, I should say, continues stricter ideological control, I mean, actually businesses that have CCP members, I can only imagine would be sort of more trusted and for the first to go to. And I think you see this actually. There's a lot of writing recently, it's not that recently, maybe 6 months, a little over a year ago, about all the CCP branches being mandated, not just in obviously state-owned firms, but in private-owned firms, and then as well in multinationals. This is what got, Marco Rubio was talking about it, and a variety of other, sort of media was reporting on it. And so I do think that, I haven't talked to people about this specific issue, but given these trends in party branches, it does suggest to me that closer connection to the CCP is an advantage, and so entrepreneurs that are CCP members, that would be an important characteristic. Lingling, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. You're very close to this as well.
Well, it's getting harder to become a CCP member these days because they really raised the bar for qualifications. So you have to be really red in order to be a CCP member. You really believe in this kind of whatever ideology.
I got a question. I'm from Africa. I thought you were going to say you have 4 wives. When you said, how do you move around? Because it's allowed in Africa. It's just a joke. So my question is about, I don't even know how to pronounce it, but Confucius. Sure. Ideology or theory or whatever. So I know during Mao's time that was not allowed, Confucius, but now the new president Xi Jinping is alluding to Confucius theories in his speeches because he likes, number one, the idea of Chinese exceptionalism to an extent, and number 2, it allows him to be undemocratic because, he tries to bring some ideas from that thought into how he governs the Chinese economy and Chinese society. And how prevalent is it, like Confucius theory? Have you looked into that, in terms of ideology or?
Good, very good question. I mean, I think so. We do actually discuss. I mean, even though I know that I don't know if it was the 4 olds or there was some campaign that was anti-Confucius under the early CCP. I can't remember. I've forgotten. But Mao actually himself was actually very influenced by Confucius. Some of his sort of ideology around sort of frugality, etc. You can make a somewhat direct tie. I think also, culture is in some ways. I mean, it's what the sort of the water that we live in, and Confucius has a huge influence on Chinese culture and social relations more generally. And I think also the sort of hierarchical relations in Confucian philosophy also very much connects in some ways to sort of more authoritarian type of systems, which certainly Mao and Xi follow. So I think it's definitely an important influence.
Perhaps the biggest influence is the, encouraging people to be deferential to authorities, right? That's the biggest influence. Please.
Can you hear me? Right. Yeah. So, I was born in the 1980s, and I think I've had quite an interesting sort of my life trajectory, having experienced China during that period of economic growth. I left China when I was 14 to study in Singapore, and studied at Raffles Institution, and then came to the US to do my undergrad, and did my master's in Zurich, and came back to the US, did my PhD at Michigan. I grew up in a generation where we all looked up to the U.S. and we all thought that U.S. had everything figured out, right? There was a period when everyone grew up admiring America. And today, having not lived in China, like more than a couple of months, or more recently, just a few weeks every year, I mean, I find myself increasingly in no man's land. I don't understand old people, but then I don't understand younger people even more so, right? The younger people are really red. You've got all this, so to speak, little pinkies, right? The Xiao Feng Hong, right? And some of the really red ones, they are really highly educated. I know some people who are Stanford educated, Ivy League APs who genuinely believe the systematic superiority of the Chinese system, right? There is somehow they make their numbers compute. And I do wonder, I want to turn this into a question, right? Having heard what you said, it doesn't really quite surprise me, having thought about it, because my dad himself was a communist entrepreneur. Because in a way, I think when you think about it, it doesn't surprise anyone, because that's your only point of reference. If you grow up a Christian, if you grow up Muslim, if you grow up, Mormon, right? You don't think about what if I took out myself into this complete independent system and pick a different point of reference. You don't, right? Even when you quit the religion, you still think from the perspective of that religion, of which you're a former member, right? So I do wonder to what extent what we're looking at today, this is kind of a response to it's all about identity, about tribalism, about my position in the world, right? Me and my relationship, just as a generic young person with the CCP and China, is really about defending my identity in the world, because even when I quit and ditch China, it's not as though I would be completely embraced by America, because I wouldn't be able to quickly pick it up anyway, right? So, and on the flip side, I wonder what China is going through is a bit of a religious fundamentalism type of, tightening, the same way you've seen in other religions like Islam. I'm being quite controversial in the way I position this, but I wonder if there's some point to that. It is about how different ideas and civilizations come into contact and define themselves by becoming more, conservative.
Sure. No, that was a really interesting question, or a set of comments, and I'm not. I'll comment on a couple sort of points that sort of stood out to me. So one is this idea of sort of identity and national identity. And, one of the things Mao is so celebrated for is actually having the Chinese people stand up. There was a century of humiliation. He talked about how China was a very loose pan of sand that he was sort of going to bring together. And I think that he is still very celebrated for that, in some ways, coalescing the modern Chinese nation state into a sort of set of identities that actually can stand up against the West. And I think that, the more recent, in some ways, ardent nationalism on the part of the youth, I think connects back to that as well, because I think that a lot of the sort of propaganda and rhetoric on the part of the party and Xi, I think pulls on that, and I think that it's it's a constrained information environment as well. I mean, the information people get, even though when I was in China, it was you could use a VPN to get out, but it was sort of a hassle. Sometimes wouldn't work, sometimes was slow. So I would easily see myself over long periods of time, sort of straying away from, using Google to search and using the New York Times just because it was a hassle. And so I do think that the propaganda environments have really ramped up, and I think that's a big part of it too.
You speak Chinese?
Some, yeah.
还可以啊，
哪里？
讲几句，秀一秀。
What did you say?
Oh,
This week.
say something. Do a little bit of showing off. Can I just follow up
Sure,
on
please
his
do.
question? It's a great question. He talked about little pinks. I just thought this fascinating, right? During the most recent wave of protests, and a lot of those protesters are also little pinks. So how do you, right, square those two things? On one hand, those young people, they grew up with a rising China. They didn't know Cultural Revolution. They didn't know Great Leap Forward. They thought China is pretty awesome, great. At the same time, they also became really frustrated with the system, zero COVID, closed China off from the rest of the world. So the same people who had such a strong nationalistic tendencies participated in the unprecedented protests that challenged the top party's leadership's authority. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's a good. I was going to ask you that. I was like, I was hoping Lingling has
Maybe.
a good. Yeah.
Maybe some in the audience can help us answer this
I would love
question.
to hear. But I do think it does speak to this sort of contradiction that, and the extent to which, I mean, the little pinks. Clearly they're very sort of vociferous online and, against the Nancy Pelosi visit and all this stuff. But maybe, being locked down has sort of broken their sort of commitment to the government. Maybe they're just saying, I'm sure some people are sort of true believers, but maybe there's a set of them that it's more about performative in some way, that it's, the...
Set up, basically.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Okay, more questions.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Professor. Really nice to meet you in person. I think in your book you mentioned that you do not endorse communism, but actually provides us great strategy to examine and to study some like business leaders and their businesses history and cultural background, because you mentioned like frugality, and for those people who experience in Cultural Revolution and a Great Leap Forward, they may behave some certain way differently. And but back to your previous book, Better Business,
What a fan.
I really like this book because, but I feel like it's from this book I understand that it's more like a bottoms up, like for individuals and for different stakeholders to press the pressure towards the government to make some changes, or make big firms to make some changes. But in China is more top down, down to the central government from Beijing. But I'm really wondering like how from the local level, from local governments and the local business can actually, how efficient and how effective they can actually notice this signal from the central government, because are they actually censoring, are they actually noticing in the right direction when the central government, are the central government is providing a clear directions for the local business and local business who has the CCP branches to go some certain path, or they're just guessing, oh, maybe we're going to path A, or maybe we should go to path C?
Yeah, good. Very. These questions are great. Very, very complex and interesting. I mean, a couple things that I would say. So one, the transmission of sort of knowledge or sort of propaganda. It's hard to know how well it's hitting the targets. But I would say a couple things about. So first of all, you look at the key performance indicators of the leaders all the way down. It's actually pretty interesting to see. I mean, GDP is obviously a big one of them, but they map somewhat to the government's priorities. So if people are going to be promoted, this is one way to try to align them. Again, there's lots of slippage and it's not perfect. And I think same with the party branches. I'm not sure exactly the communication processes with those, but I assume that there is. That's the reason why the CCP wants to have party branches in companies, so it can actually have people there that it communicates with on a regular basis, sort of aside from the authority structure in the company. That's, yeah. The other two other quick things I want to mention. So one, I really appreciate what you were describing, my prior book being bottoms up and China being sort of more top down, because that was actually the reason why I started studying China about 10 years ago, because a lot of the work I'd done has looked more at civil society and how social movements organize, and actually the change process in China is very different than that. And so I wanted to actually, that was a reason why I started studying China from a theoretical perspective.
Private businesses who actually have the CCP branches, so they will benefit definitely a lot more because they have a better communication with the central government. Is that what you're talking about?
Sure. So one of the chapters in the book looks at a variety of factors around the party branches, and one of them is they do perform better. They also, and part of it is government relations, or CCP relations. So getting the sort of communication more firsthand. One of the people I talked to said, I'm not a CCP member, but actually our company has a party branch, and there's actually was like a clubhouse sort of thing that not exactly, but a room that had like all the various journals and stuff, and he was like, I could go in there and actually read these journals. It was something that he would not be able to do if the company didn't have a party branch. Interestingly enough, one of the things, and the reason why we call them branch instead of cell, which if you look in the Western media, a lot of times these zhibu are called cells, is because they actually do in China have a function in the system that isn't just about necessarily monitoring. I mean, they actually have a lot of HR functions, and this relates to what you were saying about communism. I do think in the West, we have a lens of how business should be, and these aspects that are not sort of part of our idea of how it should be, we see very suspiciously. And I think if I was a business owner and there was a CCP branch in there, I would be very suspicious, no doubt about it. But I think that we need to also think more neutrally and say and think about, okay, this system is different than our system, and how can we actually, from a sort of more neutral social science perspective, understand the different parts of it. So,
Good. Thank you, Chris. Oh, I'll just ask. Thank you, Chris.
That gentleman in the back. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. I'm Joan Kaufman from the Schwartzman Scholars Program, and I just wanted to follow up on Lingling's point about, the entrepreneurs being very depressed at the moment. And, I guess at this moment in history, are we seeing sort of the end of individual capitalism in a way in China? And, especially with the common prosperity agenda, is there a sort of a sense that that phase has brought China up? A lot of people made money. There's a middle class and all that. And now it's much more about redistribution and socialism, Maoism and whatever, and, bringing everybody up, and, focusing on the state-owned industries. And I guess my question is, can the state-owned industries, do it? Where is China heading really in terms of its own, larger economic prosperity and competitiveness, especially with the demographic issues of, the results of the one-child policy, the large aging population, the drop-off in new entrants, working age population. I think it's a really critical moment. We at a real inflection point where if things are going to go downhill from the larger, capital accumulation kind of approach, trend which has been happening over the last reform and opening up period. I guess it's a big question, but I'd really be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree in many ways. I do think there is an incredible amount of tightening in the business infrastructure. I mean, there's lots of examples of this from crackdown on different industries, and we talked about, mandated party branches. Additionally, there's these golden shares that have been increasingly, being used where the CCP, buys about 1% of Alibaba or ByteDance or whatever and gets a seat on the board and actually veto power. And I think, so those are private firms, but there's a lot of different ways that the CCP is now injecting more formal control, aside from just the entrepreneurs and the party branch and these sort of golden chairs. And I think that's where, China's productivity engine has been. And there's been a lot of research that has shown, that state-owned enterprises are not nearly as efficient, not as innovative, and perhaps the private firms are actually going that way as well. And I think, for all the reasons you mentioned, China has a lot of economic challenges, and the legitimacy of the CCP in some ways is built upon, people thinking that tomorrow is better. And if tomorrow is not better, it's not going to be a good time. So.
One more question. That gentleman in the back, I've seen him.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. So I have a quick question about if you've seen any interest in Chinese businessmen actually moving abroad. And so I've spent a fair amount of time in Africa, Central Asia, as well as China. And you can't help but see the Chinese influence in Africa and many other developing countries. Certainly some of those are an extension of the state, but many of those are entrepreneurs. Have you seen in your studies like a growing interest in more entrepreneurs moving abroad? Is it lessened? How is that trending?
I think there's a number of different drivers. One, I do think that the government has been really promoting people, state-owned enterprise and entrepreneurs, going to developing countries. I think, Lingling mentioned earlier that in the last number of years, as people are really fed up with COVID, Singapore has become this place where a lot of wealthy Chinese entrepreneurs have gone. So I think there's a lot of reasons why. I think also, people moving back too. This gentleman from Michigan also mentioned that, people from Stanford and other places, moving back. Maybe their families have businesses. So, it's complex, but definitely there are some drivers of people moving out.
One more question, last one, please.
Is everyone just using Mao's name in a very disingenuous way? He's become rather an amorphic figure. I think he'd be turning in his grave right now. The government needs it to justify their authoritativeness, and they feel there's a pushback to their economic rise internationally. And I think a lot of these powerful people, this never would have happened if all these people were alive when Mao was in power, and we have that memory. And I think you have senior people who know better, who need to sprout the Maoist appreciation, because they need the cooperation of the government for resources or the pushback on their industries. And then you have these younger people who actually believe this. We've seen the same thing happen in our country. And then you have other people with the young using this, as they've had for 20, 30 years, as a cudgel to criticize the government by saying they're not being true to Maoist policies, when they're actually trying to just use this as a way to criticize the present government in a way that's not going to get them in trouble.
Yeah, that's very common. So certainly, the use of Mao is multifaceted. I think that the government clearly protects, his image as a key part of the legitimacy of the party. I think that there is some folks that use him in the business world in a more sort of instrumental way, like, okay, I need to say all these things to get more resources. And in some ways, that that is in economic literature on China, that's the standard view. We're trying to say that the beliefs go deeper, and I think that the extent to which the people have resonated with Xi Jinping's sort of policies and the younger people does suggest that there is a sort of deeper well of, like, I don't know if it's religious connection, but I like the metaphor earlier about how, when you're raised in a system, it's hard to actually know, what is actually part of that system versus, and not part of that system.
Well, I was told to wrap it up. We could have spent another whole day here, I think. Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for the fantastic talk about your book. Buy the book, everyone. And thank you. everyone
Thank
for
you,
coming
Linda.
and joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.